Back in high school days, 2007, we were going to practice for a theater play. So our group, that consisted of 6 people, decided that we'll go to our groupmate's private resort since she said the rooftop is huge, high up and quiet. It's a perfect place to practice. And for this story, let's name her Anna. We went there, and Anna just woke up when we arrived. We went to the resort just beside their house. Then, we are to take the stairs, but the barred gate is locked, and Anna forgot to take the keys because she just woke up. So, she said she'll get the keys. But that's when I saw a dark kid peeking out onto the left solid rails where you'll turn to the second set of stairs. I can't see the kid's face that much because he's too far away. But out of reflex, I went and told them, "Oh, may bata oh. Nakatira ba sila dito? Baka may susi siya." Which means, "Hey, there's a kid. Are they living here? Maybe they have a key." While simultaneously pointing at the kid's direction. Then the kid escaped. I didn't hear footsteps of someone running or walking away. It was silent. Then my groupmates got silent. There's this long silence between all of us, so I sucked it up and said, "Joke lang," which means, "Just kidding," to break the tension that was building up. They pretty much got angry because they were honestly scared of my joke, because they didn't see what I'm pointing at, and they said that I seemed so true about it. Anna got her keys, and we went up. There were 3 sets of stairs, and every floor has a Santo Niño in them. I didn't ask why, but deep down, I already knew why. We all practiced without any problem. Then, it's just a scene between 3 of my groupmates when Anna pulled me to the side and told me, "I know that you are not joking. Back then, before this land got sold to my parents, this place is an apartment complex, and the pool on the left side used to be a 3-story building like this, but it got caught on fire, and people died because they got trapped. So whatever it is that you saw, I believe you. That's the reason why we have holy figures all over this place." And we never went back there again for practice. I like a good ghost story. When I was younger, there were these series of books called Haunted Philippines and True Philippine Ghost Stories. They contained ghost stories and paranormal experiences from various people across the country. Some stories were in English, while the rest were in Tagalog. They were quick to read and had numerous volumes. Sometimes, they even had a section of ghost pictures near the end. You know the kind. Nonchalant landscape or family pics with a blurry figure circled in red. Some of them actually look convincing and downright creepy. I love that series. Though, I should have enjoyed them while they lasted. As of last year, they seem to have been discontinued and are difficult to find in bookstores now. To me, these books were good entertainment. Growing up in the Philippines provided no shortage of ghost stories and mythical legends. It seemed like everyone had a story to tell or knew someone who had one. I've had a handful of relatives in my family who claimed to have had encounters with a ghost, or multo as we call them in our native language. I never thought that I'd have my own stories to share, but that quickly changed very recently. My family and I had recently taken a trip back to the Philippines. It was long overdue as I had not seen my relatives in my home country in several years. It was a bit strange to see all of my younger cousins grown up, but it was a great experience just to see them all again and spend time with them. On our first week there, we were on our way back to my aunt's house from a long day from shopping, when the conversation in the car turned to supernatural occurrences. Our culture is heavy on religion and tradition, and we can be very superstitious at times. There are numerous stories of mythical monsters in Filipino culture, and hearing about them from my parents and relatives only furthered my interest. They included the tikbalang, which was a monster that frequented the forest and the mountains. It is described as a large, humanoid creature with the head and limbs of a horse. So basically, the Bojack Horseman. The capre was more of a tale for kids. It's described as a tall troll-like creature that resides in large trees, where it smokes a cigar, waiting to scare off children that are out too late at night. But he's usually regarded as non-violent though. Another one is a tiyanak, and they're the stuff of nightmares. In remote areas near the forest, you'd hear the faint crying of a baby. If you follow these sounds deep into the woods, it could lead you to being perpetually lost. Or, if you are really unlucky, you'd find the source. You'd stumble upon what looks like a baby on the ground, but in actuality, it's a small ghastly creature that will transform and eat you if you get too close. Then, there's the aswang, a shapeshifter that feeds on human flesh at night. A specific species of them called a manananggal, which translates literally to remover, is a particularly terrifying one. By day, they are in the form of a regular woman, but by night, they feed. They root their legs to the ground as their top half detaches itself, sprouts bat-like wings, and takes flight. They mainly target pregnant women, and they have long vine-like tongues that slither down and eat the fetus as they hover right outside the window. I know, pretty crazy stuff, right? I've always regarded these tales with a healthy amount of salt and a full dose of fear. They were cool and unique, but I could happily live the rest of my life not encountering any of them, even if they were indeed real. And even when I moved to America, I was still wary of those regional creatures. Anyways, during the car ride, my cousin spoke of strange sightings and experiences they've had, all with varying degrees of believability and silliness. My dad relayed some tales from his younger years about how his group of friends would encounter this and that. He was always ever so dramatic with his storytelling. It was all in good fun, but throughout the whole conversation, my mom remained quiet. She was the hard skeptic type and would always dismiss those stories as silly folklore. However, at that moment, it looked like she had something to say. My curiosity took over, and I finally asked her if she had any ghostly encounters. She looked at me and nodded. Back during her college years, when she was studying to be a nurse, she lived on the campus of a very old school not too far from the city that I was born. Living conditions were pretty rough, and 4 of them had to share a room half the size of a normal American college dorm. On top of that, the campus used to be an infirmary during the World War II. Hundreds of soldiers from both sides passed through and died within the walls of that hospital. Residents of the dorms would speak of strange noises in the night. Footsteps, faint echoes, and knocking were heard in certain parts of the building. There were rumors that the place was also a temporary orphanage at one point in time, and that a handful of children had died there. They said you could hear children's laughter in the walls if you listened closely. On more than one occasion, my mom and her roommates would wake up to faint shuffling noises in the room, like someone small was moving about. When they looked around, they wouldn't see anyone, so they dismissed it and went back to sleep. It wouldn't be until the following morning that they saw what looked like footprints on the wall and ceiling. They were the size of a child's. One of her roommates moved out after that. One night, a close friend of my mom was heading back to her room after a late study session. She was wary of the supernatural, so she kept her head down and walked quickly through the halls. As she passed by one of the empty rooms, something caught her eye. That large room used to be a triage area when the place was still a hospital. The old rusted beds were left there and abandoned, and the room was used for storage. She said she saw half a dozen men lying on the beds. They looked injured and bandaged, and they wore what looked like the uniform of an American soldier from World War II. She stood frozen in place as she felt the coldest chill she'd ever experienced in her life. Then one of the soldiers sat straight up and slowly turned towards her. That was enough to snap her back to her senses, and she took off running towards her room. When she got to her dorm and told her friends what she saw, the brave ones of the group headed to the room to investigate. When they got there, the beds were empty. Ever the skeptic, my mom didn't put much stock in those stories. That is until one early morning when she experienced something that challenged her stance and bothers her to this day. In the morning before classes, my mom would wake up extra early so she can get first dibs on the showers in the community bathrooms. It wasn't too hard, since a lot of the residents had convinced themselves that the place was really haunted and were unwilling to venture out on their own that early. My mom mostly ignored those stories, and she always got to class early. That morning, she did her usual routine and it went off without a hitch. And as she was walking back to her room, she heard it. She said it sounded like whispers. She stopped and turned around, and down the hallway, a figure stood just at the end of darkness. The lights weren't in the best condition in that wing, so it was dim. Still, my mom could discern that that figure was dressed like a nun. That didn't make any sense, since there were no nuns on campus and the nearest church was several miles away. Staying completely calm, my mom turned and walked away. She quickened her pace and her own footsteps echoed in the empty hall. She strained to hear any other noises, but heard none. When she turned right to another hallway, she saw the nun from the corner of her eye. It was closer and definitely following her. As she got closer to her dorm, she turned around once more, and the nun was at the end of the hall, just as far away from her when she just first saw it. The nun stood still, as if she'd been standing there the whole time. My mom quickly reached her door and struggled to unlock it. Daring one more look, she turned to her left, but the nun was gone. Relieved, she turned the lock, and as she did, she moved to pick up her stuff and felt an unnaturally cold chill. She slowly looked right, and it was right there. The nun, on the other end of the hall, except now she was much closer and fully in the light. On instinct, my mom turned the knob and threw her door open, and that's when the child ran out. A small kindergarten-aged child ran out of her dorm room, brushed past her leg, and ran towards the nun. The child was laughing innocently, as if playing a game of tag. My mom watched as the child ran past the nun and disappeared into another room. After a few moments, the nun turned and followed the child. My mom asked around after that experience and learned that the last time there were children or nuns in the campus was back when it was a temporary orphanage several years ago. They shut it down after a tragic fire killed a dozen children and a few nuns looking after them. She never experienced anything else out of the ordinary after that, and after she told that story, we all sat stunned in our seats. Mom had been holding out on me. I was thrilled, but also terrified of what I just heard. See, at that time, I had a passive interest in the paranormal. It wasn't anything serious and nowhere near obsession levels. I wasn't out to prove that the afterlife existed, nor was I determined to find out if ghosts and spirits were real, to find some sort of meaning in this chaotic world. Did I believe in the supernatural? Not really, but I'd be open to the possibility. My interest in the subject was purely recreational, like someone who enjoys horror movies or knitting sweaters. In fact, while I was reading up on urban legends and enjoying hearing ghost stories, I am also terrified by them. My imagination, fueled by stuff I've read and scary movies I've watched, would always get the best of me when I'm alone in the dark. It was a sort of interesting paradox, kind of like how at one point in my childhood I was fascinated by snakes as animals, but I was deathly afraid of encountering one in the wild. And to be honest, I was still a little bit jealous of my mom that she had such a cool story to tell. I wished at that moment that I had my own story. Well, you know what they say about being careful what you wish for. Yeah. Later on in the trip, we visited my uncle who lived a few towns over. There, he lived with his family where he ran a very lucrative farming business. On the way there, we passed a long bridge that went over a steep ravine with a river below. As our car rode along the bridge, I couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. It made sense, since I'd traveled over this bridge many times before when I visited my uncle and cousins. However, underneath that feeling was a sense of unadulterated fear and dread. Like something bad had happened here and it somehow directly affected me. A distant memory screaming to be remembered. As if on cue, my dad pointed out that this bridge was infamous to the surrounding towns and cities because of the White Lady. Now, like the Capre or the Tikbalang, the White Lady is another one of the ghost stories told around the country. She is perhaps the most well-known, since different countries also have their own version. In America, she's usually called the Lady in White. In Spanish culture, she's La Llorona. The basic idea remains the same. A ghostly-looking woman dressed in a long white dress and long dark hair stands on the side of isolated roads, waiting to hitch a ride. The scenarios vary, but in the Philippines, if you stopped and gave her a ride, she would quietly enter your back seat. If you don't interact with her, she'll leave you alone until she disappears from your car some distance later. If you see her on the road and keep driving, she will suddenly appear in your car and attack you. Moral is, it's better to give her a ride than not. When we arrived at my uncle's large house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the bridge had somehow directly affected me. After a delicious dinner and a round of video games with my cousins, I found my uncle out in the balcony having a drink. He offered me a beer since I was finally old enough, and I took a seat next to him. "Hey Tito, do you remember anything about the bridge right outside of town?" He put his drink down and regarded me for a few moments. He cut straight to the chase. "You were really young when it happened. I suppose you didn't remember it much." Now, I was fully intrigued. I had to know. What exactly happened? His warm smile faded, and he told his tale. As the story went on, the memories began to flood my mind, memories that I had long since repressed as a defense mechanism. All the details came to me in excruciating clarity, as if it just happened yesterday. By the time he had finished the story, there was no denying it. I had encountered a ghost all those years ago. It was the mid-90s and I was still living in the Philippines. I was a plucky 6-year-old that was all about adventure and exploring. Once or twice a week, I would spend the night at my uncle's farm back then, a small budding business. The town it was in was smaller then and fairly remote. I loved that place because there were so many areas to explore, but only in the daytime. One particular night, I was over at his place just watching TV. My uncle got a call of a new delivery of chicken feed that needed to be picked up in the next town. At that time, he only had a few farm hands, and they all had the night off. Usually, He wouldn't make a supply run this late at night, but he was behind schedule and needed to pick up the supplies or risk losing profit. As he headed out, he asked me if I wanted to tag along, and ever the restless child, I immediately agreed. My uncle had an old Toyota SUV that he used for all his delivery pickups. I sat in the second row, my usual spot, while my uncle slid into the driver's seat. Most of the voyage was uneventful. It was nearly 11 p.m. at night, so there was hardly any other vehicles on the road. Upon crossing the bridge the first time, nothing happened. During that time, the bridge was newly constructed. It was put up the year before, after the original bridge was ravaged by the last typhoon. The city even put streetlights on the new bridge for better visibility. That was a huge deal, since none of the other surrounding roads had streetlights. We arrived at the next town, and I helped my uncle load up the supplies. Well, at least as much as a small 6-year-old can. On the way back home was when it happened. I was sitting in the back seat, absent-mindedly looking out the window, when I felt the car slow down. We were almost at the bridge, and I noticed that something wasn't right. I was too small to see over the seat and out the windshield, but I could tell that all the lights on the bridge were off. At this point, the car slowed down to a crawl. "Hey, sport, why don't you lie down and take a little nap?" my uncle said from the front. Something in his voice didn't sound right. It sounded like he was scared and was struggling to hide it. "Nah, that's okay. I'm not tired." "Please, just do it for me, okay?" He sounded stern, but measured. My uncle was usually an easygoing guy, so when he got serious, you should pay attention. "Okay," I said as I lay down in the seat sideways. I briefly saw my uncle's eyes in the rearview mirror. They showed unmistakable fear, and I felt the familiar bump that signaled that we were on the bridge. Then the car stopped. "Close your eyes, okay? No matter what, keep them closed." "Okay." I started to get scared. I didn't know what was happening or why I had to close my eyes. Regardless, I shut them tight. Then, the strangest thing happened. My uncle started to sing. It was a traditional Filipino folk song, and I'd only heard it once before. About a year ago, my aunt and uncle got into a shouting match, as in a things were thrown across the room type of shouting match. I was at their house, and at that time, my cousins and I stayed in the room, cowering and waiting for the storm to pass. An hour later, my uncle entered the room and apologized for the shouting. He then started singing that song to lull us to sleep. The melody was beautiful, and I'd never known my uncle could sing that well. He never did it again, at least not until that moment when we were in that dark bridge. The song sounded just as beautiful, but I could tell his voice was shaking. His car wasn't that big, but I was a small child and there was a lot of room in the second row. I was laying down on the seat, perpendicular to the windows, trying and hoping for some sleep to come. Instead, something else arrived. I heard the familiar mechanism of the lights flashing. All of a sudden, I sensed that I wasn't alone in that second row anymore. My spatial awareness of the car told me that there was someone or something else sitting right next to me. We had gained another passenger. I shut my eyes even tighter as my uncle began to drive. The temperature inside the car became cold, and I curled myself into a ball, seeking refuge from whatever it was that was now right next to me. I didn't know much about ghosts and supernatural creatures at that age, and though I couldn't see it, something told me that I was in the presence of something not of this world. My uncle finished the song and started over again. I was amazed that he was able to keep this composure, I refused to open my eyes. I could hear her, so uncomfortably close next to me. At first, I heard what sounded like clicking. As it increased in volume, it sounded like stalks of celery being twisted and broken. It was unnerving. Those sounds weren't normal, and they were all around me. We finally crossed over the bridge, but she was still there. I was so scared I could barely move. The car hit a bump, which caused me to slide to the side, closer to her, and I felt damp cloth against my leg. My breaths became shallow, and I started to cry. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I opened my eyes for a split second. In that split second, I saw her. A brief flash of white with stringy damp hair on her head, blacker than night, and she was turned away from me. I blinked the tears from my eyes. When I opened them again, the mass of black hair was now right in front of my face. I shut my eyes tight again, and after what seemed like an eternity, the car hit a familiar curve on the road that signaled the entrance into our town. I felt that entity come even closer to me, but this time, my uncle was silent. No more songs. The air became even colder right next to my face, and I shook, not from the cold, but from terror. Then she spoke right into my ear. It was a hushed whisper, lower than any whisper I've ever heard. I couldn't make out what she said. It didn't sound threatening or angry. It sounded sad. And then she was gone. I immediately felt the difference. I could no longer feel another presence in the car, and the air went from cold to tropical humid again, and I heard my uncle breathe a sigh of relief. I didn't open my eyes until we had reached the safety of the farm. My uncle had to carry me back inside and straight into my bed, and only then did I open my eyes. From what I could recall, we never spoke of that night to anyone, not even each other, ever again. Subsequent trips across the bridge at night never resulted in another white lady sighting. At least, not for me. I'd find out later that in the early 80s, a woman was found dead at the bottom of the bridge, and people said that she was traveling to the next town and was hoping to catch a ride with any passing vehicles. It was late at night, and she had no family nearby that could give her a ride. No one knows what really happened, but many suspected that it was murder. After my trip back to the Philippines, I couldn't stop thinking about that night at the bridge. How could I forget such an incredible and terrifying experience? I guess it doesn't matter since I remember it now. But there was something else I realized about that night, something that I hadn't remembered before. When I heard her whisper, I thought I only heard unintelligible garble, but that's not true. She did say something. She said, "Maraming salamat." Translated to English, that means, "Thank you very much." I don't know what I had seen on that particular summer in the Philippines. Alright, before I jump into it, I'll give you a little bit of a background first. My grandparents live at a small village and owned a very old and very large wooden house. I remember staying at that house every summer when I was very little, and that the bugs were huge. The moths alone were as big as my face. The surrounding area was very lush and very green, and it was usually suffocating and hot and humid during the day. At night, I remember the house creaking and moaning with the wind. I don't think I ever thought that was creepy when I was a kid. My nanny, which is common to have in the Philippines, would sleep in my room with me, so I never felt alone or helpless. I also had a rosary around my neck that my parents had given me when I was just a baby. I often caressed it if I was feeling sad or scared. Anyway, there wasn't much to be afraid of. Crime was nearly non-existent in that small community, and everyone knew each other. Of course, since it was the countryside, houses and neighbors were pretty far apart. Most houses were in view, but still, there wasn't any need to worry about things like that there. So, this is where I bring up the bridge. I can't talk about everything else without talking about that bridge first. There was a small and simple, rust-red bridge, maybe 20 feet long over a little dried-up stream. There was an overgrowth of weeds and plants surrounding the bridge, and you couldn't really see it until you were near it. The bridge led to a very thick forest, and I was absolutely forbidden to go through it. Well, according to my nanny. Anyway, the other details of it are a little hazy, but I distinctly remember its red coloring. For some reason, its color was the subject of speculation by the other kids in the village. Tatay said the bridge was made of iron, but it's rusted, so now it's not safe to cross. Bayani, the son of the local rice farmer, said. No, said Mildred with wide, terrified eyes. My yaya said it was made by a bruja, and it's made of children's blood to make it stronger. I looked at Mildred and said, I think your yaya told you that because you're such a brat and she wants to kill you. I said teasingly, and I swear that doesn't sound as horrible in Filipino, but she still gave me a reproachful look. I laughed and turned to look at Lou, the quiet kid among us and the bastard son of a rice cake peddler, which in the Philippines is the equivalent of a milkman in the United States. And to my surprise, he spoke up. No, he said quietly. Nanay said that it's a portal to the netherworld, so we should never cross it. We all stared at him, surprised that he contributed to the conversation. Then Mildred piped up. What do you know? You don't even know your father. She screamed with laughter. Bayani hit her arm and she immediately started crying, even though we knew it didn't hurt her at all. We rolled our eyes. When I heard my yaya call out to me for dinner, I ran to her, and I remember that the rest of the day was spent thinking about what Lou had said. Speculation about the bridge was usually about exactly just the bridge, but Lou insisted that it led to something sinister, which caught up my rapt attention. It wasn't the bridge itself that we should have been concerned about, but it was where the bridge led. He and I sit at the start of the bridge, fearful to cross it not because of the possible danger, but because of what my yaya would have done to us if she ever found out we did. Look, Lou said one afternoon. Do you see that? He pointed into the thicket. What? I asked, squinting to see. There's a path, he said. I looked harder. There was a path, but it disappeared into the trees, and there was no way we could know where it led from just looking at it. One lazy and particularly hot afternoon, the four of us played hide and seek, and Lou was it. Lou almost immediately found me. I was sitting in the overgrowth of plants near the bridge, my back to it. I knew I would find you here, he said in a whisper. I laughed. Why are you whispering? I asked him, amused. It was then I noticed that he was looking past me. What are you looking at? I whispered anxiously. I suddenly felt the heavy weight of dread in my heart, and my throat felt like it was closing. He said nothing. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and the color drained from his tanned face. It was clear that his gaze was affixed to something, and I dreaded to turn around to find out what it was. It felt like the heat was more intense, and the humidity soaked my dress in cold sweat. I slowly turned my head to look at the bridge, but before it came into view, Lou grabbed my arm and started running, He was taller than me and his legs longer, and I felt like I hardly touched the ground. Lou kept running and running until we saw Bayani and Mildred a few feet away. Suddenly, my foot caught on a rock and we tumbled. I absent-mindedly grabbed the rosary around my neck and accidentally tore it off in my tumble. I felt my left ankle snap as I landed on it wrongly. I dropped the rosary in my hand and I cried out in pain. "What the heck were you guys doing?" Bayani yelled as he and Mildred jogged towards us. At that point, I was overcome with pain, and Lou kept apologizing. Mildred ran to my grandparents' house to call my nanny. That night, I found out that I had broken my ankle after the doctor visited our house. I remember being disgusted by the man. He was the tallest man I had ever seen, and also the palest, but he was very fat. I remember feeling his weight sinking the wooden floors near my bed as he examined my ankle. My hand went to my neck in search of the rosary, but I remember that I had lost it in my tumble that afternoon. My grandmother invited him to stay for dinner, and he obliged. The doctor sat at one end of our large mahogany dinner table, and my grandfather sat on the other end. My grandmother sat with Yaya next to her, and Lou and I sat next to each other. Lou was penitent all throughout the rest of the day and refused to go home. When my nanny called his mother, she wasn't home. "Of course, he can stay with us," my grandmother said after my nanny asked her. My grandmother was a very gracious and kind woman. My grandfather was not unkind, but he was sterner, with a loud and boisterous voice. "So, doctor," he said at the dinner, "you're new around here. What do you think of this place?" My grandfather finished off the remaining mango juice in his glass, and my yaya filled it once more. The doctor was chewing his food when my grandfather asked, and I could hear the food sloshing around his mouth. His breathing was very loud and almost like he was snoring, but he was obviously awake, and he swallowed loudly. "It's very peaceful," the doctor replied, wiping the corners of his mouth but missing the bit of food on his chin entirely. "It's very different from Manila, but I don't miss it. This is home now." My grandfather liked the sound of that. "Well, I'm glad you feel that way," grandfather said. "The nearest doctor is quite from here. I'm glad that we finally have one within the community." He made approving noises as he drank from his glass. "Where do you live around here, doctor?" grandmother inquired. "I didn't even know that you had moved into our community until I asked Gloria next door if she had a doctor's number. She told me that she saw a man with a doctor's bag crossing the bridge the other day and that he was headed to Juan's house in the trees. I was surprised to hear someone had moved in without my knowing." She chuckled. "Us old people are pretty nosy." The doctor smiled his close-mouthed smile. "Yes, well, my brother is very ill," he said. "I came here from Manila just days ago to care for him. I haven't really had the time to introduce myself to everyone. I've been with him day and night, ensuring his fast recovery." He then asked my yaya for water, and she smiled politely. "Juan used to have a ranch there, didn't he?" My grandmother asked him, and he nodded. "Yes, but not anymore. He has a few chickens now and a horse, but nothing more than that." Then he turned his head to me. "Is your ankle feeling all right?" he asked me. Something about the question had an ingenuine quality to me, but no one seemed to notice. But then I noticed Lou's eyes never left his plate. When I simply stared at him and didn't reply, my grandmother laughed. "Hey, little girl, the nice man asked you a question." I looked at her, and then to him, and his gaze made my skin crawl. "I feel fine, thank you," I replied politely. Lou's arm grazed mine, and I felt his goosebumps. The doctor then smiled his unreadable smile. "Good," he said. "It should heal up nicely, but I wouldn't go around running with your friends anytime soon." "Especially not by that infernal bridge," my grandfather added. "A harbinger for tetanus and other dangers." The adults made a noise of agreement. After dinner, Lou and I were dismissed so that the adults could talk and smoke cigarettes. In Philippine culture, it is polite for children to take the adult's hand and press it to their foreheads, either in greeting or goodbye. Traditionally, it was a kiss on the hand, but that is considered old-fashioned. So I, along with Lou, pressed my grandfather's hand to my forehead and he kissed the top of our heads. I did the same thing for my grandmother, and she too kissed our heads. When I walked away after that, my grandfather clicked his tongue in disapproval. "Come back here," he said. "Why would you be so rude to our guest?" I turned to limp back to the table and to the doctor. My grandfather apologized for me, and when I reached the doctor, he held his hand out expectantly. I took his sausage-like fingers into my hand, and I remember how cold and clammy they were. I pressed them to my forehead, smelling dinner on them. Lou timidly did the same, and as I pulled away, the doctor gave us a small smile and whispered, "Thank you." Lou and I sat in my bedroom with my yaya, who was reading her magazine. Lou and I played some cards and said nearly nothing. When we heard the adults' conversation move outside to the front of the house, we went to the window to look down. The doctor was saying his farewell, and we could hear grandmother and grandfather chuckling and thanking him. They chatted for a couple minutes more, until the doctor said that he really had to get back to his brother. When he was about to leave, he looked up at us and raised his hand in a wave. Lou and I said nothing, and he laughed, and we watched him cross the bridge and disappear into the trees. That night, Lou and I laid awake in bed, the sheet up to our chins despite the hot weather. I waited for Yaya snoring before I nudged him. "Are you up?" I whispered. He slowly nodded his head. "Lou, what did you see at the bridge this afternoon?" I turned my head to look at him, only to find him with furrowed eyebrows and staring at the ceiling. "Past the bridge, I saw that doctor," he whispered back, "with a pale man slung across his shoulders." As he said the words, I felt my heart beating wildly against my chest. Then Lou added, "He saw us." "How's your ankle?" Bayani asked. My friends decided to hang out with me in my bedroom a while the next day. Mildred was looking at the clothes in my closet, and Lou was playing with my crutches. It's really sore," I replied. "I can't really do much." "Hey, that's not true. Why don't you come outside with us and we could catch some lizards?" Bayani offered. Mildred snorted in disgust. "That's nasty. No," she said, and Bayani made a face. "I don't think I asked you, brat," he sneered. She threw a slipper at him, and he ducked. She breathed out heavily and plunked down on the edge of my bed. Everyone was really bored. Then Mildred had a suggestion. "We should cross that bridge and see what's beyond it." The room was quiet. Lou rested my crutches against the wall. "I don't think that's a good idea at all," I said. "Even the adults never cross that bridge. There is nothing there but poisonous plants and huge bugs." "Ugh," Mildred scoffed. "Everyone is boring here," she said. "Everyone in town is really old and boring. Why would they explore anything?" She paused and then added, "The doctor lives there." "So why disturb him? He's taking care of his brother. The last thing he wants is children bothering him," I said, making an effort to hide my anxiety at her suggestion. Mildred, of course, picked up immediately. "Why don't you like that doctor?" she asked. I think it's a bad idea, Lou interrupted before I could respond. It gave me a relieved look. It was then Bayani piped up. I think it's not a bad idea. The doctor will not mind visitors. Anyway, we wouldn't stay there long, just visit. He looked out my window and to the bridge. But that bridge is dangerous, I said desperately, and Bayani laughed. Okay, how about I ask my parents for permission? I know that they have tried to visit him one afternoon to give him a housewarming gift, but they said he wasn't home. I'm sure my parents would like it if I gave him their basket for them, he said. And before I could say anything to deter him, he said, Come on, Mildred, let's go. And they left. After a few minutes, Lou and I watched Bayani and Mildred walk to the bridge. Why would his parents let him even cross that bridge? I said incredulously. Lou shrugged. Everyone sees the doctor crossing it. I guess it's not as dangerous as everyone thought. We waited and waited for Bayani and Mildred to appear from the woods. In the first hour of waiting, I thought that things were going to be fine, and as my yaya often told me, I was just imagining things. After the third hour, and as the sun was slowly disappearing, I worried. Lou had fallen asleep, and Yaya would check on me every now and then, and I would tell her I'm fine and she would leave me alone. Eventually, I fell asleep too. Wake up! I heard Yaya say as I woke up to a hand gently shaking me. There she was, leaning over me, and she smiled and woke up Lou. What's happening? I asked confusedly. Lou stretched awake. Your friends are here, she said, and I heard Bayani and Mildred going up the stairs. I let out a sigh of relief, and when they reached my room, Yaya left. Bayani and Mildred looked excited. His house is beautiful, Mildred said. It's enormous, Bayani said. The two of them were excitedly talking over each other, describing the doctor's house, and when I asked if there was anything weird they noticed, they immediately shook their heads. But then Mildred said, Well, there is one thing, she said. There was this really bad smell coming from the upstairs towards the back of the house. As she said that, I felt a pit in my stomach. And I thought it was weird that he wouldn't let us see the backyard, but he said there was a lot of junk there that he needs to clean up. Bayani added. Why did you want to see his backyard? Lou asked, and Bayani shrugged. I wanted to see the animals, he said, and I remember Father telling me that the stream came from the mountain and near Mr. Juan's house. I wanted to see how far the stream reached. He shrugged again. Stupid, since the stream is dried up. Mildred chided, and I ignored her comment. Did you see his brother, Mr. Juan? I asked them, and they shook their heads. He's sick, and the doctor said that he needed his rest, Bayani said. Well, why would we want to see a sick man anyway? The house was so beautiful, we didn't really care, Mildred said, and the rest of the conversation was about the grand piano in Mr. Juan's house, the tall ceilings, and the echo. The next day, it rained heavily. Now, the rain in the Philippines can be such a heavy downpour, and the rain on that day was exactly that. The rain was so heavy that everything looked like a blur. The trees, the other houses. There was a blackout and we had to use candles. I remember sitting at my bedroom window, just looking towards the bridge and the trees, but it was impossible to see. I don't know why I stared at it. I just felt like maybe the doctor would appear suddenly as a large demon, screaming towards our house and ready to eat me. Even then, I knew that was a ridiculous imagination, but I couldn't look away. The rain stopped sometime in the middle of the night, and I remember being awoken by a different sound from the crickets and the nighttime birds. I sat up in bed and listened carefully to distinguish the sounds. It was the sound of water, but not rain, more like a stream. I hobbled over to the window. "What are you doing?" my yaya asked sleepily. She walked over to me to look at what I was looking. "Oh my goodness!" she exclaimed. "There's water under that bridge again!" The next day, people used the stream for everything: drinking water, washing clothes, bathing. But then after a few days, the water seemed to turn rancid, and suddenly the people who used the stream had gotten very sick. When someone's young child died, there was an uproar. "We have to know what happened to this water," the child's mother said, and the others agreed. "Where is the doctor? Why has no one called him?" another cried. Among the din of outraged protest, Mildred spoke up. "Bayani and I tried to visit him yesterday, but the ground was too muddy and slippery. From where we stood, it didn't seem like anyone was home anyway." "But the doctor is 2 hours away. We need the doctor." Everyone was yelling angrily and desperately until the barangay captain, the elected official of the community, spoke up. "Okay, let's go to Mr. Juan's house and see the doctor." Everyone shouted in agreement, and like a mob, they walked into the thicket. I couldn't go with them because of my injury, so this is how I remember Lou described the events that followed to me. There was an awful smell of rot that started at about 20 feet of Mr. Juan's property. The ground was muddy and slippery from the rain, and it was a difficult hike that the older people stayed behind. But Lou, Bayani, and Mildred, my grandparents, and all the other people trekked on. He said that as they approached the property, the smell was so acrid and rotten that he felt a sharp sting in his nostrils. At some point, Mildred went to stay behind with the old people. When they all reached Mr. Juan's door, they banged on it, but no answer came. They banged and banged on it, but again, no answer. Impatient and angry, they all went around the house to see the back, and they saw the stream. It was almost a full river. It was running forcefully. But then, they found the source of the terrible odor. There was what looked like a horse lying on its side in the stream. A tree had fallen, and it stopped the horse from going with the current. The horse was dead, but it wasn't the only source of the rancid smell. In the stream, dead chickens lay near the horse, just stewing in the water and rotting. Some people retched at the sight and smell of rot, and Lou said that when he and grandfather and the barangay captain closed in on the horse, they immediately noticed something extremely odd and unsettling. The horse and the chickens and a few stray dogs that laid in the water, they were all dried up. As in, they looked deflated and dry. Lou had a hard time explaining it. Another thing they noticed was that all the dead animals had their throats slashed, but there was no sign of blood anywhere. Confused and outraged, Lou said that my grandfather stormed to the back door of the house and broke a window. He opened the door from the other side, and again, the rancid smell filled their nostrils. But this time, it seemed to come from upstairs. Lou and Bayani entered the house with my grandfather and the barangay captain and a few other men, but they told the 2 children to stay at the foot of the stairs. The man went up, footsteps echoing. Then the footsteps and shuffling stopped. It was silent for a moment, but then the men started to come down the stairs again. The men said nothing. Only their shoes on the wooden stairs could be heard. "What happened? What is it?" Bayani asked excitedly. No one paid him any attention. Frustrated, he ran upstairs. "No, Bayani!" Lou shouted, running after him. Lou said the smell was so bad that it stung his eyes. There were several rooms on the upstairs, but only one door was open, and it happened to be the source of the smell. Bayani reached it first, and as he ran to the door, he stopped dead in his tracks. Then he started to vomit. When Lou came into the room, he described to me what he saw with great difficulty. "It was Mr. Juan," he said. He started to cry and he wiped them angrily with a hand. Mr. Juan, his mouth was open, like screaming, but no sound. He was so skinny. His skin clung to his bones, and he was so pale. The maggots and flies." He cried fully then. He was the one the doctor was carrying on his shoulders that one time when we were playing. It was like all the blood was gone from his body. His throat had a large cut on it. He sobbed, and I comforted him, although I was terrified. Where was the doctor?" I stammered, fearful of the answer. "We couldn't find him. Everyone looked everywhere." He sniffled and added, "That's not all. The barangay captain said that the cut in his throat looked like it was healed, then cut again, over and over for weeks, until it was cut deep enough to kill him." After the incident, the police from outside the community came to investigate. They could find nothing, only the fact that the animals in the stream had been really drained of blood, and so was Mr. Juan. There was no information about the doctor, and I remember the police finding it ridiculous that no one knew his name. "We simply called him Doctor," my grandmother once told them when she was questioned. "Nothing bad ever happens here. We never thought." The next day, my parents came to pick me up. Not much was said to me, and I remember saying goodbye to my friends. I didn't see much of them or the village again after that, and my grandparents visited us from then on. After some time, the whole incident was forgotten. A year or so later, my grandmother told us that Mr. Juan's house had been burned down and that the bridge was torn down. I suppose that's for the best anyway. I hadn't thought about it for years and years until this morning. Sometimes, no matter how traumatizing something can be, life goes on regardless and you forget about it. But even if you forget, it doesn't really mean that it never happened. The thing that brought back all of it was, in my apartment, thousands of miles away in Los Angeles, I found the rosary, the one that I had torn off and lost all those years ago. It was resting against my pillow when I woke up this morning. Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate each and every one of you. But I would also want to thank my awesome patrons, Fire05, Gabro, Maskino, and Ralph. If you want to support the channel further, you can be a patron too. But remember, it's appreciated, but never a requirement. I would also like to announce that we have merch now. The link is in the description of the video, along with all my other social media links, like my Discord server, Twitter, Instagram, and others. You can connect with me and send your stories there. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and comments are highly appreciated. And remember, your fear feeds me.